We need to keep kids safe online, but some special interests are sending policymakers in the wrong direction, pushing the so-called App Store Accountability Act, demanding government ID from all users just to download an app, replacing parents' judgment with government mandates. It doesn't even stand up in court. A better bipartisan bill, the Parents Over Platforms Act, would put parents in the driver's seat, empowering parents and businesses to keep kids safe without drowning all of us in red tape. Tell Congress to get it done right and put parents over platforms.
Paid for by ACT, the App Association.
You ever notice how the scariest stories are the ones you think you know? The ones you've seen on screen repeated 1,000 times until they feel like fact. But here's the twist. What if everything you thought you knew about one of the most famous hauntings in America was wrong? What if the truth wasn't demons or witches or priests saving the day, but something messier, more human, and honestly, way more disturbing? Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13, your weekly paranormal podcast with me, your host Matt, where every week we explore the mysteries that make the world feel a little bit off. Tonight we're diving into the real story behind The Conjuring, and I mean the real story. We're going to live through 10 years of terror with the Perron family, room by room, night by night. And then we'll pull back the curtain and show you how that truth got twisted and packaged and sold until most people don't even know it exists anymore. So settle in, because this one isn't just about ghosts, it's about trauma, exploitation, and how legends get manufactured. And fair warning, the Hollywood version is the least scary part. This is the true story of the Perron family haunting and the Conjuring house. So we're going back to 1970. Picture this, Carolyn Perron has reached her breaking point. She's tired of living in the suburbs in Providence, the traffic, the neighbors practically breathing down their necks, the endless amounts of noise. She wants space and open fields where her 5 daughters can just kind of run free. You know, the Norman Rockwell kind of childhood you see in paintings of New England homesteads. But here is the thing about dreams. Sometimes they're born from our worst nightmares. For Carolyn, it wasn't just restlessness driving her out of the city. It was heartbreak that still makes her voice crack even decades later when she talks about it. Her daughter Andrea had been walking their beloved family dog when it broke free, ran into that busy street, and, well, you can guess what happened there. That single moment, watching her daughter's face crumple, holding nothing but a limp leash, shattered something fundamental in Carolyn. That is it, she told her husband Roger. I want away from all this chaos. I want somewhere safe. Now, I don't know if I believe in fate, but I have to admit that what happened next feels almost orchestrated. It's kind of like the universe was listening to Carolyn's plea, and a newspaper ad practically fell into her lap. A colonial farmhouse, 14 rooms, 200 acres of Rhode Island countryside, built in 1736, the old Arnold estate in Harrisville. And when the Perrons went to look at it on a cold, crisp winter day, you can understand why they were just enchanted. This wasn't just a house, it was living, breathing history. The realtor told them 8 generations had been born and died within that house. Walking through those rooms, you could feel the weight of centuries in the beams. You could see it in the wide planked floors, worn smooth by countless footsteps. You could sense it in the massive stone hearth that had warmed families through wars, plagues, and peaceful times alike. And the girls, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, ranging from 5 to 12 years old, they ran through those rooms like they were exploring some magical castle. And Carolyn, she could barely picture Christmas mornings by that hearth, summer days with the girls picking wildflowers in the meadows. This was it. This was the idyllic childhood she had dreamed of giving them. Now, Roger, being the practical one, had his concerns. Money was tight. He worked as a truck driver, and the house was listed for $72,000, which was a serious stretch that would mean years of sacrifice. Now, to put that into perspective, $72,000 is the equivalent of $600,000 today, which is a lot of money. Now, that being said, in today's market, 200 acres in Rhode Island for $600,000 is still a steal. But in 1970, it was something that Roger didn't know how he was going to be able to pay for this. But looking at his wife's face and seeing his daughter's excitement, how could he say no? They scraped together every penny they had. They took out loans that made him nervous. And in January 1971, those keys were finally theirs. And this is when something interesting happened. As they were signing the papers, the seller, this old man named Mr. Kenyon, pulled Roger aside. His old, weathered hand gripped Roger's shoulder, and he said something that would echo in Roger's mind for years to come. "Leave the lights on at night. The house gets dark." And Roger kind of chuckled nervously. I mean, of course, old houses get dark. That's what electricity is for. He figured it was just practical advice about old wiring or maybe navigating, those steep colonial stairs in the middle of the night. He had absolutely no idea that he'd just received the understatement of the century. And for those first few weeks, it really was everything Carolyn had dreamed of. The girls adapted the way kids do, quickly and completely. They were like little explorers, discovering every nook and cranny of this sprawling new home. They found a cellar with stone walls that seemed to whisper secrets to them if they listened carefully enough. And there was a root cellar that stayed mysteriously cool even in the summer heat. And up in the attic, it was like a treasure trove of previous lives. Old trunks, faded photographs, children's toys from decades past. Carolyn threw herself into making it home. She was hanging curtains and arranging furniture, planting a garden. The house seemed to welcome them with open arms, creaking gently as it settled around them like this protective embrace. But you know what they say about houses that old? They hold memories, and not all memories are the pleasant kind. The first sign was something so pretty mundane you would probably almost laugh if it wasn't so unsettling. Carolyn's broom. She would prop it against the kitchen counter after sweeping, like most people do. But then she would find it somewhere else entirely. The living room, the dining room, sometimes impossibly leaning against an upstairs wall. And when she asked the girls about it, they swore up and down they hadn't touched it. And then came the dirt. Now, Carolyn was meticulous about her housekeeping. She'd sweep those floors until they were gleaming, and then return maybe an hour later to find small piles of dirt scattered around the floor. Not tracked in from outside, these were perfectly round mounds, like someone had deliberately placed them there with almost artistic precision. Now, Roger would say it must be the girls whenever Carolyn brought it up to him. But here's the thing, the girls were at school when this would happen. And now this is when the sounds started. And at first, just your typical old house sounds, boards expanding and contracting, pipes settling into place. But gradually, Carolyn began hearing something else. A rhythmic scraping from the kitchen, like metal dragging across stone. She'd investigate every time, heart pounding, only to find the kitchen completely empty, every pot and pan exactly where it should be. And the girls started having their own experiences too. Toys they'd left scattered across the rooms would be arranged in neat, precise lines when they woke up, and doors that they'd definitely closed would be standing wide open in the morning. And sometimes when they were playing quietly in their rooms, they'd hear footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate footsteps heading toward the bedrooms. "It's just an old house," Roger would say whenever Carolyn brought it up. And you have to understand, he was gone a lot for work, driving, he drove long-haul truck lines. So when he was home on weekends, everything seemed perfectly normal. The house put on its best behavior when Dad was around, like it had these perfect manners. But Carolyn and the girls, they knew better. Something else was living in that house with them. They just didn't know what yet. And by the end of their first year, the activity had escalated way beyond missing brooms and mysterious dirt piles. The Perron family was living in a house that seemed to pulse with its own invisible life. First came this ungodly, disgusting smell. Sudden, overwhelming waves of rotting flesh that would fill an entire room and then vanish as quickly as they'd appear. Not from any source you could identify. No dead animals in the walls, no forgotten food anywhere. The house would smell completely normal one moment and then reek of death the next, leaving the entire family gagging and throwing open windows in the middle of winter. But it was the 5:15 a.m. wake-up calls that really got to them. Every single morning, without fail, at exactly 5:15, something would shake the beds. And I don't mean gentle trembling. I'm talking violent, terrifying shaking that would launch the girls from sleep like they'd been hit with an earthquake. Their beds would literally bounce off the floor. The headboards would slam against the walls with so much force that pictures fell and the plaster would crack. It was like the house was determined that absolutely no one would sleep past dawn. And that's when they began to see them. The spirits weren't hiding anymore. The girls started seeing multiple figures throughout the house, some clearer than others, some just glimpses of movement when you weren't looking directly. There was a woman in white who would stand at the foot of their beds, just watching, silently. There was a man in work clothes who'd appear down in the basement looking confused, as if he couldn't quite remember why he was there or what he was supposed to be doing. Now, not all of them felt threatening. There was one spirit the girls called Manny, and he seemed almost protective. He'd appear when they were frightened, and somehow his presence radiated this sense of calm and of safety. Little Cindy told her mother about a woman who would kiss her goodnight smelling of fruit and flowers. These gentle presences felt kind of like guardians, remnants of the families who'd truly loved this house before the Perrons arrived. But not all of them were kind. Carolyn began experiencing something different entirely. Focused, malevolent attention from something that seemed to hate her specifically. She'd feel eyes watching her constantly, and this presence followed her from room to room like a shadow with this ill intent. And when she'd whip around to look, nothing would be there, but that feeling of being observed and being hunted, it never left her. The figure revealed itself gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. Like when we had dial-up internet and you're downloading a photo and you get bit by bit by bit. First is just a shadow that didn't match any physical object in the room. Then as glimpses of a woman with long dark hair. And finally, in full terrifying detail, a woman with her head hanging unnaturally to one side, her neck clearly broken, eyes filled with what Carolyn could only describe as pure rage and jealousy. And this spirit didn't just watch like the others, it acted. One evening, Carolyn was lying exhausted on the living room sofa, just trying to steal a few moments of peace. Suddenly, she screamed. On her left calf was a fresh bleeding wound, a perfect circle, as if she'd been stabbed with a large needle. And there was no needle anywhere. No attacker, no explanation, just blood and the absolute certainty that something had hurt her deliberately with precision and malice. Roger was home for the weekend, and when he saw that wound, his skepticism started cracking right then and there. He helped bandage it, sure, but you could see the doubt creeping in. This wasn't stress, this wasn't imagination. This was real, and it was happening to his wife. And the attacks on Carolyn escalated from there. She would find bruises on her arms in perfect shape of fingers, like someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. And objects would fly at her, not falling accidentally. They were launched with precision and clear intent to harm. The house that had welcomed her family with such warmth was now rejecting her specifically, violently, and she had absolutely no idea why. While Carolyn was bearing the brunt of whatever was angry in that house, the 5 Perron daughters were developing their own complex relationships with these unseen residents. Andrea, being the eldest, became kind of like the family historian. She spent hours at the town library digging through records about the Arnold estate's past, learning about all the families who'd lived there over the centuries. She'd discovered births and deaths, loves and losses, just ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary times. Gradually, she began to see these spirits not as invaders or threats, but as former residents who'd simply never really left. Like they were all just sharing the same space across different times. And the younger girls adapted with that incredible resilience that children have. They learned which rooms felt safe and which ones to avoid. They developed their own unspoken rules. Don't go in the cellar alone. Always say hello when entering a room, and never ever taunt or challenge whatever was there. It was like living with invisible roommates who had their own preferences and boundaries. And April, the youngest, seemed to have the strongest connection to whatever was happening. She'd have these elaborate conversations with people only she could see, laughing at jokes no one else heard, playing games with companions that existed in some reality parallel to ours. When her parents questioned her about it, she described these detailed interactions with children who'd lived in the house generations ago. And her matter-of-fact acceptance was both comforting and absolutely chilling at the same time. But even kids have their breaking points. They'd wake up to find their rooms completely rearranged, furniture moved, belongings relocated to places they'd never put them. They'd hear voices calling their names from rooms they knew were empty. And on the worst nights, all 5 girls would pile into one bed, huddled together while the house came alive around them with footsteps, slamming doors, and sounds they couldn't begin to identify. Nancy developed severe insomnia because she was too afraid to sleep alone. And Christine started sleepwalking, found standing in rooms she never entered while awake, staring at walls like she was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. And Cindy began having these recurring nightmares about the house burning down with all of them trapped inside. And the remarkable thing is, the girls never complained to their friends or teachers about any of this. This became normal to them, their secret world that no one else would understand or believe. They learned to distinguish between the gentle spirits and the angry ones, the protective presences and the malevolent forces. They created this whole mythology around their invisible housemates like they were anthropologists studying a culture no one else could see. But as the months turned into years, you could see the weight of it all starting to take its toll on every single one of them. By 1973, 2 years into what was supposed to be their dream life, the Perron family was fracturing under this constant invisible pressure. Roger was away more often, and yeah, partly it was work, but if we're being honest, partly it was because the house seemed quieter when he wasn't there. And it was a fact that kind of filled him with guilt and confusion that he couldn't quite shake. And this was running a big toll on their marriage, because Roger was this skeptic who didn't believe what was happening, and things were calm when he was there. And Caroline, who's there living through all of this, is freaking out trying to explain to Roger that this is not something she's making up. This is not a story. This is not a fabrication. These things are happening. She was running on pure adrenaline and exhaustion, jumping at every sound and checking and rechecking locks that would mysteriously open themselves anyway. The attacks on her were becoming more frequent and more violent. She'd find herself get pushed down the stairs for no reason, locked in closets with doors that shouldn't have been able to lock from the outside, and awakened by invisible hands shaking her so hard she would have bruises the next day. And those circular wounds kept appearing regularly, always in new places, always perfectly round, and always completely unexplainable. It was like she was being systematically marked by something that wanted to claim her. The children were starting to show serious signs of stress too. Their grades started slipping at school, and they became secretive, whispering amongst themselves, creating almost their own language to discuss things they knew adults wouldn't understand or believe. They were aging beyond their years, developing this wariness that no child should have to carry. And that's when word somehow reached Ed and Lorraine Warren. And you guys have heard of the Warrens. They're the ones who have the museum with the Annabelle doll and all of that haunting. This is that couple. Now, here's something important to understand, that the Warrens didn't get called in by this family like you see in the movies. They showed up uninvited, claiming they'd heard about the case through their network of contacts in what they called the supernatural community. Ed was a former police officer turned self-proclaimed demonologist, and Lorraine, who claimed to be a clairvoyant medium, arrived at the Arnold estate like some kind of supernatural first responders that nobody had actually called. And from the moment Lorraine stepped through that front door, she claimed to sense these powerful, malevolent forces. She walked through the house like she owned the place, describing presences and energies the family had been living with for years. But more than that, and this is crucial, she gave them names and faces and complete backstories. The broken-necked woman who'd been tormenting Carolyn, Lorraine identified her immediately. Bathsheba Sherman, a 19th century witch who'd lived on the property. And according to Lorraine, Bathsheba had worshipped Satan, murdered infants with knitting needles, and cursed the land before hanging herself from a tree in the backyard. And she was now possessing Carolyn, trying to drive her to the same fate. And suddenly, all that random terror had structure. The inexplicable had explanation. The chaos finally had a clear villain with motivations and methods. It was exactly what a traumatized family desperately wanted to hear. And the Warrens convinced the family that only a seance could resolve the nightmare. They needed to confront Bathsheba directly, force her to release whatever hold she had on Carolyn, and move on to whatever awaited her in the afterlife. And Roger had serious doubts about this plan. Sure, the house was chaotic and frightening, but his family was still together, still functioning. They were managing somehow. What if making direct contact made everything worse? What if they opened a door they couldn't close again? And on top of that, he was still skeptical and not actually thinking this stuff was actually happening. But Carolyn was desperate. These attacks were escalating, becoming more violent and more frequent, and she was genuinely beginning to fear for her life. So if the Warrens could end this nightmare once and for all, she was willing to try anything. So the seance took place on a bitter cold evening in February 1974. Roger and Carolyn gathered around the dining room table with the Warrens, who also brought several other investigators with them, along with all their equipment to document whatever was about to happen. And what was about to happen would haunt the Perron family for the rest of their lives. According to Andrea, who secretly watched through a crack in the door, the session began quietly enough. Lorraine called out to Bathsheba, demanding she show herself, demanding explanations for her actions, and for several long minutes, absolutely nothing happened. But then Carolyn began to change. Her voice dropped to this guttural growl that didn't sound human. Her face contorted into expressions of rage and hatred that her family had never seen before. And according to everyone who witnessed it, her chair began to levitate, actually lifting several feet off the ground while she still remained seated in it, still channeling whatever force had taken hold of her. The thing speaking through Carolyn claimed to be Bathsheba. It spoke of hatred for the living, of rage at being disturbed, of absolute determination to claim Carolyn's life as payment for trespassing on what it called cursed ground. It described murders in graphic, horrifying detail, threatened the children specifically, and promised that death was the only escape from its torment. Then Carolyn was literally flung from that floating chair, her body crashing against the far wall with this sickening thud. And she lay motionless for what felt like forever before beginning to convulse, her limbs twisting at angles that shouldn't even have been possible. And that is when Roger completely lost it. He lunged at Ed Warren, grabbing him by the shirt, screaming that they'd made everything infinitely worse. A full physical fight broke out, these middle-aged men grappling in a dining room while a woman writhed on the floor, possibly dying right in front of them. And when Carolyn finally stopped convulsing and returned to herself, she had no memory of what had happened, none at all, but she was fundamentally changed, weaker and more fragile, as if something vital had been drained from her during that terrifying episode. Roger threw the Warrens out that very night and banned them from ever returning to his property. Whatever they'd done, it hadn't helped his family. If anything, the house felt angrier afterward, more violent and unpredictable than before. The Warrens left, for sure, but they took something valuable with them, a story they would tell and retell for the rest of their careers, growing more dramatic with each telling. And here's what might surprise you after this. The Perron family remained in the Arnold estate for 6 more years after the Warrens' so-called intervention. The supernatural activity never stopped. If anything, it seemed to intensify after that seance, as if the attempt to banish these spirits had only made them more determined to stay and more aggressive about defending their territory. But something remarkable happened during those years. The family adapted in ways that would probably fascinate psychologists. They developed these elaborate coping mechanisms, unspoken rules for living with the impossible. They learned to sleep through these violent 5:15 a.m. disturbances. They acknowledged the gentle spirits like old friends and carefully avoided the malevolent ones. They found ways to coexist with forces they couldn't understand, control, or explain to anyone else. Carolyn never fully recovered from what happened during that seance. The attacks continued, but she grew stronger in response, more defiant. If something wanted to torment her, fine, she'd endure it. This was her home, her family's sanctuary, and she absolutely refused to be driven out by anything, living or dead. The girls grew up in that house, navigating typical adolescent changes alongside their invisible residents. They learned to distinguish between normal teenage emotional turmoil and supernatural influence, which is a skill I'm pretty sure they don't teach in any parenting book. They developed this almost casual relationship with the paranormal that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In 1980, it was finally financial pressures that forced the parents to sell, not fear. They left quietly, without any fanfare, carrying with them a decade of memories that no one else would ever believe. They'd survived something that challenged every assumption they'd had about reality and what was possible in this world. The house remained behind, waiting patiently for its next family, its next story to unfold within those ancient walls. So that is the Perron family story. 10 years of terror, adaptation, and ultimately survival in a house that seemed determined to test every limit they had. It's compelling and incredibly detailed and absolutely terrifying in its mundane persistence. It's also not the story most people know. Because somewhere between 1974 and 2013, that story got fed through the Warren mythology machine. Then Hollywood's profit-driven narrative factory, until what finally emerged bore almost no resemblance to what the Perrons actually lived through. So let's pull back the curtain here and examine what really happened versus what was invented for our entertainment. So first, we need to be completely clear about who Ed and Lorraine Warren actually were, or are, because their public image and the reality don't exactly match up. Ed Warren was a former police officer who reinvented himself as a self-taught demonologist, which, by the way, is a title with absolutely no official certification, oversight, or standardized training. And Lorraine claimed to be a clairvoyant medium with psychic abilities that conveniently couldn't be scientifically verified or tested under controlled circumstances. What they were, essentially, were entrepreneurs in the supernatural business. They built their entire careers on investigating paranormal claims and then turning those investigations into books, lectures, television appearances, and media opportunities. They needed compelling stories with clear narratives, obvious villains, and dramatic resolutions that audiences could follow and remember. The messy, ongoing reality of the Perron haunting, a family slowly learning to coexist with unexplained phenomena over the course of a decade, didn't fit their business model at all. It was too complex, too ambiguous, too lacking in the kind of clear-cut good versus evil narrative that sells books and fills halls. So they did what any good storytellers do when reality doesn't cooperate. They changed it. The Warrens transformed the Perrons' complex, decade-long experience into this simple, digestible narrative. Demonic witch possesses innocent mother, holy investigators swoop in to intervene, and evil is dramatically vanquished through the power of faith and expertise. They took Carolyn's mysterious attacker, the broken-necked woman the family had actually encountered, and gave her a complete identity, an elaborate backstory, and motivations that served their purposes perfectly. But here's the crucial point that most people don't realize: they invented almost all of it. So let's talk about the real Bathsheba Sherman for a moment, because honestly, she deserves much better than what the Warrens did to her memory. Bathsheba Thayer was born in 1812 in Rhode Island. She married a farmer named Judson Sherman, and they had at least one child, a son named Herbert, who lived to adulthood, got married himself, and had children of his own. Bathsheba was eventually widowed, remarried, and died in 1885 of a stroke at the age of 73. Her funeral was officiated by a Baptist minister in what was, by all accounts, a perfectly standard Christian service. That's it. That's her entire documented story. No witchcraft, no infant murders, no Satan worship, no dramatic suicide by hanging. She was just a person, a 19th century farm wife who lived and died in rural Rhode Island. And in fact, and this is important, property records clearly show that Bathsheba never even lived in the Arnold estate where the Perrons had their experiences. She was a neighbor living on adjacent land. The connection between her and the house was nothing more than geographic proximity. Every single dramatic detail the Warrens attributed to her, the knitting needle murders, the occult practices, the curse on the land, was complete and total fabrication. They took an ordinary woman who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life and turned her into a horror movie monster for their own purposes. And the consequences of that fabrication are real and ongoing. Thanks to the Warrens' fictional version of her story, Bathsheba Sherman's gravestone has been repeatedly vandalized by people who think they're striking a blow against evil. Her name has become synonymous with supernatural malevolence in popular culture. A woman who did nothing more remarkable than live and die in 19th century rural America has been posthumously transformed into this symbol of demonic evil. She became the Warrens' perfect scapegoat, the convenient explanation for phenomena they couldn't actually understand, control, or resolve. And fast forward to 2013, when James Wan's The Conjuring hit theaters. By then, the Warren version of the Perron story had been filtered through decades of retellings, each iteration moving further and further from whatever truth had originally existed. The movie took the Warrens' already heavily distorted narrative and pushed it straight into pure fiction. In Hollywood's version, we get this neat package where Ed Warren is presented as a qualified expert who performs a successful exorcism. The haunting is definitively demonic, rather than the complex mix of both benevolent and malevolent spirits, and Bathsheba is the clear villain, complete with that elaborate backstory lifted entirely from Warren mythology. And the family is saved through Warren intervention, living happily ever after. The film was marketed heavily as based on a true story. But here's the thing, Andrea Perron herself, the eldest daughter who lived through the actual experience, has stated publicly that the movie is approximately 95% fiction. So think about that for a second. The real story, a family learning to coexist with unexplained phenomena over the course of 10 years, developing coping mechanisms and ultimately finding a way to survive something that challenged their understanding of reality, doesn't fit Hollywood's 3-act structure. It doesn't have clear heroes and villains. It doesn't have a dramatic climax and resolution. So they manufactured all of that, creating a crisis, creating a hero, and creating a resolution that bore virtually no resemblance to what actually happened. But for most audiences, the Hollywood version became the definitive account. The movie was a massive commercial success, spawning an entire cinematic universe based on Warren cases, cementing their reputation as paranormal heroes rather than the opportunistic entrepreneurs that many researchers believe them to have been. The success of The Conjuring created real-world consequences that are still playing out today, and they're not pretty. The current owners of the Arnold estate, now known universally as the Conjuring House, thanks to the movie, have to deal with this constant harassment from fans who are absolutely convinced they're living in some kind of demonic stronghold. Norma Sutcliffe, who owned the house from 1987 to 2013, lived there peacefully for decades. Then the movie was released, and suddenly her quiet home was under siege by tourists, thrill seekers, and wannabe ghost hunters showing up at all hours. She eventually had to sue Warner Brothers, calling it a Conjuring instigated siege of her property. The people who bought it from her have turned the notoriety into a business, offering tours and paranormal investigations. But even that enterprise has been plagued by legal problems, complaints from neighbors, and all the chaos that comes with trying to build a business on a fictional foundation. Meanwhile, Bathsheba Sherman's grave continues to be vandalized by people who are convinced she was a murderous witch. A woman who did absolutely nothing more than live and die in 19th century Rhode Island has become the target of ongoing grave desecration based on a complete fabrication. And the Perron family? Their real trauma, their actual decade of fear and gradual adaptation, has been buried under so many layers of fiction that most people don't even know their true story exists. Their experiences became raw material for other people's profit, and their genuine trauma was twisted beyond all recognition. So here is what we know for absolute certain. The Perron family experienced something profound in that house. Whether you want to call it paranormal, psychological, or some complex combination of both, their fear was genuine. Their trauma was real. They lived for 10 years with phenomena they couldn't explain, understand, or control. But they also survived. They adapted. They found ways to coexist with the forces that terrified them, showing this kind of remarkable resilience in the face of the impossible that's actually pretty inspiring. The problem is, survival doesn't sell movie tickets. Adaptation doesn't launch franchises. Resilience doesn't create compelling villains or satisfying resolutions. So the Warrens gave audiences a villain. Hollywood gave them a resolution, and the public accepted the fiction as truth because, let's be honest, it was more emotionally satisfying than messy reality. The Perron family's actual story is about survival, adaptation, and the complex ways families respond to inexplicable crises. The Warren and Hollywood version is about good versus evil with clear heroes and villains and a resolution that makes everyone feel better. What story do you think is actually more frightening? The one where the monsters are defeated, or the one where ordinary people learn to live with forces beyond their understanding and somehow find the strength to keep going anyway? So remember, next time you see based on a true story in a movie trailer or a game or something, remember that the truth is often stranger and more complex and more fundamentally human than fiction. Because here's the thing I keep coming back to. The real monsters aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're the people who profit from other people's pain and who turn genuine trauma into entertainment and who create villains from victims and heroes from opportunists. And that, everyone, is the Perron family haunting and the Conjuring house story. Everyone knows the movie and everyone bases it on the movie. But the movie is such a small fraction of what actually happened. And it's done nothing but cause problems for all the real people involved with this, whether alive or dead. And we see this all the time with inspired by a true story, blah, blah, blah. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for instance, inspired by a true story. I had a friend in high school who was convinced that when that movie came out, it was 100% accurate based on them putting that disclaimer. The real story has nothing to do with a chainsaw-wielding maniac in the Texas woods. It doesn't. But people like the story, and they like, as we showed here, they like the villain, the hero, and the conclusion. And this is what happened with the Perron family. And this is also what happened with the Annabelle doll. Now, I am not going to say anything more on the Annabelle doll because if you follow me on TikTok, you know that I ran into some issues the last time I did. So I'm just going to leave it at that. So go look up the true story of that so you can understand how the Warrens have manipulated that story as well. But that is the story of the Perrons and what they actually went through versus what the movie franchise is based off of. If you guys like this episode, please go on your podcast app that you're listening on and give us a rating and leave a review. It is by far the best way to help grow the show and reach more people. And I would really appreciate it if you could do that. It would be awesome. And also check out the Patreon, patreon.com/paranormaldirective13. We have 14 minisodes up there right now with more to come. And there is pictures of every story on there. There will be pictures of this story on there. And there's going to be more bonus content added on there as well. And congratulations to the winners of the social media contest to get a free month of Patreon so they can check it out and hopefully continue to stay members of the Directive on there. Make sure to check us out on social media, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, all at Paranormal Directive 13. I am very active on those with new stuff and daily posts and all that. And I like to respond to people on there because it's an easy way to keep in touch with everyone. So check those out. And if you have any questions, any comments, any ideas, send an email over at paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. And I will take a look at those so we can get some more stories up and running over here. And remember, everyone, keep investigating the unknown, because sometimes the scary part isn't the story, it's what's still in the house.